Welcome to your independent facilitation training for those seeking to serve self-determination program participants. This is provided by the East Bay Independent Facilitation Work Group, a partnership between the Regional Center of the East Bay Self-Determination Local Advisory Committee and the Bay Area Office of the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. We're glad you've joined us for this 8-session series. Section 1. An overview of the self-determination program from the independent facilitator perspective. Your guide for this session is me, Sheridan Nicolau. Today we'll cover history of the self-determination program, otherwise referred to as SDP. We will cover the principles of self-determination, the process, and roles. So the history of self-determination. So self-determination as a concept and as a way of receiving services and supports, it's not new, folks. It's not new in the United States, and it's not new in California. Self-determination is actually a part of an international movement that speaks to changes in the way that people help design services that work for them, the expectations to get the supports and services that will result in what we hope are positive outcomes according to the person served, according to the participant, and what's really meaningful to them and based on their principles and their values. And this is an important movement, and it's really part of that larger civil rights movement as well. So California passed the Lanterman Act over 50 years ago. And the Lanterman Act is where California spelled out some of the ideals and the principles around self-determination. So then in the late 1990s, California created the pilot project for self-determination. And this was really because of the strong advocacy across the state, with many self-advocates, family advocates, and policymakers working together tirelessly to get self-determination off the ground in the form of this pilot project that got started. We all learned a lot from the pilot project, and that took place in about 5 regional centers across the state, serving about 200 people. Most of all, we learned that self-determination is a dynamic and an adaptive way that people can access supports and services that are right for them. And seeing the success led to tremendous additional grassroots efforts and systemic efforts to get self-determination legislation passed in California. And that happened, it was passed in California in 2013. So we'll talk more about the principles and the values associated with self-determination, but first let's touch on this. Self-determination and the self-determination program in California is so important to Californians with intellectual and developmental disabilities, their families, their advocates, and their allies. And that's really because if you think about traditional services accessed through regional centers in California, traditional services can't always meet the needs of all individuals in the most equitable way. And while there is a lot of work that's being done each year by Department of Developmental Services, by regional centers, by the communities that they serve, there's a lot of work done in partnership to develop innovative and impactful community-based services to meet those needs of those community members, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And so you think about that naturally with traditional services, because there isn't that flexibility in that innovative way to look at service delivery. We do have people that are underserved, either due to geographic factors, language factors, cultural factors. Existing services just cannot meet everybody's needs, and people have unique needs and need to get those needs met in unique ways. And really, people want more control over their lives. Many people want supports to help them be a greater part of their communities. All the things that comes with, right? To have jobs, to have friends, to choose how or where to worship, and to have a more meaningful life, and all of the forms that looks like for people. So that's in part why the community push towards self-determination was so critical. So the pilot project was successful. But again, remember, the pilot project just served a handful of people relatively, right? A small amount of people across 5 regional centers. So in October 2013, Governor Brown signs the Senate Bill 468 to make self-determination available statewide. So huge success, right? Everybody's very excited, but we can't quite get started yet because at that time, then we still had to wait and work together for another 5 years to get the federal approval process in place. So that was a lot of work on the part of Department of Developmental Services, as well as other departments, advocates, and allies. So once that 5-year federal approval process was wrapped up, hooray, we're off to the races now, right? So now, now at this time in history, we're talking about 2018, and we have a 3-year phase-in process for self-determination. So in that 3-year phase-in process, that means that only about 2,500 Californians have been able to participate in self-determination program. Because the idea is to work out those final kinks, the process, the systems to make self-determination program a smoother, more productive, and more successful experience. Because remember, even though self-determination as a concept and as a movement is well established, is not new, the nuts and the bolts and the inner workings of how it works in California at full scale, that is something new, and that's something important to do right. So Department of Developmental Services, regional centers, the statewide Self-Determination Advisory Committee, the 21 Self-Determination local advisory committees, people with IDD and advocates of all kinds are all hard at work to troubleshoot the issues, to fine-tune those systems, and to get ready for the full phase-in targeted for this summer, 2021. And by the way, anybody interested in independent facilitation work should definitely take the time, aside from these training sections, these modules, to really dig into the self-determination program statute that's located in California's Welfare and Institution Code, section 4685.8. So do some of that reading. You'll really get a lot from it. All right, so let's go into the principles, okay? So there's 5 principles of self-determination. You probably know this already from the work that you've done so far in self-determination, but let's talk a little bit more. Again, we're focused on the big picture for this section. So let's start with freedom. For people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's so critical that they be able to exercise the same rights as all people, to establish with freely chosen supports, family and friends, where they want to live, with whom they want to live with, how they spend their time, and who supports them, right? So that's, paramount when we think about self-determination. Authority to control a budget, to control services and supports of a person's choosing, to have more options than just regional center vendored services, right? Because we talked about some of the natural limitations of vendored services in a particular area and who they may not fully serve. Support to arrange for the supports and the services that are flexible, right? They need to be flexible enough to meet the person's needs, for them to live their lives in their communities in their way. Responsibilities. Self-determination is a lot of responsibility. And this includes the responsibility for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families to make decisions in their own lives, to be accountable for the use of those public dollars. Confirmation. It's an important role, and it's about the confirmation of the role at the center of it all, right? That people with developmental disabilities and their families have in making decisions about their own lives. And this includes the designing and the arrangement of those services and supports needed. So those are those 5 principles. It's really important that we keep those in mind. So a few things also to keep in mind as we go through this higher level overview of the program. Okay, so what is self-determination? It's not about getting more or less services. The emphasis is really on choice, control, and access. Okay, so budget for services and supports, we'll talk a little bit about that. It's a voluntary program, okay? So people can join, people can leave the program if they need to and go back to traditional services. You can stay in the program. People can stay in the program if they move. They can transfer their self-determination types of services, framework for services, if they move someplace else in California. And you do have to live in a community setting. So what that means is the person in self-determination must live in a community setting, not a licensed long-term healthcare facility or developmental center. However, if you are there, but you might be moving from there to a community setting within 90 days, then you can get started with self-determination. So keep that in mind. And for the budget, we're going to talk a lot about the budget in these training sections. But for now, let's just make sure that we see that this budget is the amount of money that a self-determination program participant has available to purchase needed services and supports. Okay, so we'll start there, but we're going to give you more information about the budget. Don't worry. So what do we mean when we talk about more control, more choice, more access? So this talks a little bit about what it looks like here, okay? So self-determination allows, service dollars. With self-determination, people can spend their service dollars to buy the supports that are right for them. Hiring workers. They can hire their own workers, including relatives, neighbors, or friends. These are people who speak their language, who know their culture, can meet their needs their way. Hiring agencies. They can contract with agencies for services and negotiate what to pay, what the services will be, and when they need to receive it. So there's that choice and flexibility and access. Speaking of flexibility, if a worker or an agency isn't a good fit, there's the flexibility to find other people or to change agencies. And as an independent facilitator or someone who's interested in independent facilitation, you're always keeping these higher level categories of control and choices in mind, and helping the person that you're serving use these choices, use these controls, and use these access points for the best outcomes based on their goals, their lifestyle, their person-centered plan. Okay, so keep in mind on the left-hand side of that slide there, that choice, that control, and that access, it's all about impacting lives in their way, in a way that's more customized and more individualized than traditional services can offer. All right, a lot going on here, right? So this maps out a little bit more about the process, the various steps, the large scale steps of self-determination, okay? So let's start with orientation, right? So people have attended, if they're starting self-determination, they're attending an orientation on self-determination. And they're completing that orientation to help them learn more about self-determination, how it works, and really just the foundational skills and values in the process, right? So they're spending a lot of time talking about the process and the roles within self-determination and how that will look for that individual. A person-centered plan. So you as an independent facilitator or as someone who's interested in independent facilitation, you're going to be hearing a lot more on both person-centered thinking and person-centered planning. And this is really critical. All strong working relationships and all strong independent facilitation work really starts from person-centered thinking and then transitions to effective person-centered planning. You as an independent facilitator should take the time that you need to be well acquainted with the principles of both person-centered thinking and person-centered planning, various formats of person-centered planning, tools that are useful, even if you're not helping facilitate a person-centered plan for somebody as a part of your independent facilitation duties. It's just important foundational knowledge that you should have. A person can start working on their person-centered plan with their chosen circle of support before or after they have completed the self-determination orientation. So keep that in mind. And if a person served would like to choose to pay someone to assist them or pay somebody to facilitate their person-centered plan, they can do that as long as the person they seek to pay has training in person-centered planning and in self-determination. And there's a few different ways that looks. So we'll talk more about that in upcoming sections. But I would really recommend that you, as someone who's interested in independent facilitation, please read some of the Department of Developmental Services directives that are posted on the website. There are 2 of them around person-centered planning. So that's important for you to see and to understand to support others. So let's go to the spending plan, okay? So the spending plan, in short, it's a plan for how the person served will spend their self-determination money to meet the goals identified in their person-centered plan and their individualized program plan, IPP. The regional center certifies the spending plan. They certify the budget, and then they send that over to the financial management services with the person's individualized program plan. We'll talk more about what that looks like, the budget certification process, the spending plan, and then moving forward and working with the financial management services. An important reminder, and one we'll talk a little bit more about later, is that generic services, and when we say generic services, that means services that are funded through other generic sources, okay? So through health insurance, through school district services, non-regional center sources. Those generic sources will need to be accessed first before accessing funds through the self-determination budget. IHSS is another category of what would be considered generic services that a person would utilize first if they have those services before accessing their self-determination dollars. And you'll hear more about this. We're just introducing the concepts at this point. Individual program plan, IPP. The person's regional center service coordinator or case manager helps with this process, and the person served can involve any members of their circle of support. The person served can use the goals worked out and identified in their person-centered plan to develop the individualized program plan, the IPP. And then here we go. We've already mentioned this, financial management services. You're going to be hearing a lot more about financial management services. This is the only service that is required for people that are in self-determination program. And it's also the only required vendored service in self-determination program. So it's up to people whether or not they want to access traditional vendored services in self-determination, but this they have to have financial management services. And you're going to learn a lot more about that, but in general, there are 3 models of this service. So you're going to learn about that about these 3 models and what that looks like. But for now, just know that financial management services pays for services and supports. The financial management services helps with following employment laws, managing your spending plan, and helping that person make sure that they stay in their budget, and can help kind of flag when it's time for the person served in their circle of support in their regional center team to get connected to figure out any larger adjustments that might need to be made in their self-determination plan. Independent facilitator. So this might be you, right? So independent facilitator is a new role, and it's a new role that is specific to self-determination. But there's a lot of traditional advocacy components to independent facilitator, so it shouldn't feel too strange of a role. And it is optional. So people in self-determination do not have to have an independent facilitator. They and their circle of support can perform some independent facilitator duties of their choosing. The person can ask their regional center service coordinator or their case manager to perform some of those duties of independent facilitation, or the person can choose to bring on a paid or an unpaid independent facilitator. A self-determination participant can also have more than one person helping with those duties, can kind of break them up into different roles. An independent facilitator helps with plan implementation, can help the person served locate services and supports that they need to meet their needs in the plan. And if a person with self-determination chooses to pay somebody to be an independent facilitator, the person they pay needs to have training in, you guessed it, person-centered planning and self-determination. And then people have to use, if they're in self-determination, they use their spending plan to pay them if they're choosing to pay their independent facilitator through a contract of some sort. So definitely, if you're someone who's interested in independent facilitation, take a look at the language in the statute, and then also take a look at some of the Department of Developmental Services directives, including the directive specifically on independent facilitation. All right, so this is another way to look specifically at the players involved in self-determination. But let's note first, on the left-hand side, who the decision maker is. Who is the driver? The central focal point of the program is the participant, the person served, the person with the intellectual and developmental disability at the center of all of this work. So you'll notice that with this decision maker, they're working with some of the other key players, including the independent facilitator, optionally, right? Because that is an option. People can choose to utilize an independent facilitator or not and help design exactly how that looks. That independent facilitator, again, they can facilitate person-centered plans. They can help navigate the program. They can assist with identifying community resources, services, supports. They can help advocate and voice the wants and the needs of the person served, of the participant. So the decision maker, the participant, is also engaging with the rest of their circle of support. And that can include family and friends, people that know that person best, that are kind of their team, assisting the person. And those folks can assist with the person-centered plan, the individualized program plan, and managing the program, help them manage the program. So then there's the IPP team, the Individualized Program Plan team. So that's a team that develops written services, certifies the budget, and is looking at the spending plan, responds to the change in circumstances, and then you know it's the requirement, right? FMS. FMS is the required services, the financial management services, managing individual budget, making payments, facilitates the criminal background checks as needed, right? So there's a few different things that they do, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, so local self-determination advisory committees. I cannot say enough about the importance of the self-determination local advisory committees, okay? The purpose of the local advisory committees is to provide insight and advice to the regional center in the implementation of self-determination, to work with their regional center and to work with the state council and to work with the larger community to make it successful, both successful for that catchment area, and then think about all of the communities that make up that catchment area, right? So making sure that self-determination can be successful for all individuals that it can benefit, that it can serve. So the meetings of these local advisory committees are open to the public, and the public, advocates, participants, all highly encouraged to participate in these community committee meetings. Half of the committee voting members are appointed by the regional center for that area, and half are appointed by the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. And there's a tie-breaking vote membership slot for Disability Rights of California's Office of Clients' Rights Advocacy. So refer to your regional center's website for more information on your local advisory committee, the meeting times. You can look at some past agendas, meeting minutes. The Regional Center of the East Bay has a self-determination section on their website that gives you all that information about the local committee meeting agendas and minutes and resources. And they also have an interest list that you can get on so that you can stay better in touch with self-determination work in the East Bay. We'd love to have you involved, so please take a look and consider joining us and in getting involved in these meetings. So independent facilitator. So we're going to talk a little bit more about roles now. So for the independent facilitator, remember it's chosen, hired by, works for, and responsible to the person served, the participant in self-determination. Independent facilitators, they bring a lot of different skills and knowledge into that market, and some may focus on helping in certain areas and others not, right? So you'll kind of think about how you develop that specialty if you are serving others as an independent facilitator. The independent facilitator contracts with people served, with participants for specific kinds of supports, detailed in a contract agreement. And again, it's optional. It's optional for the person served. It's optional for the participant in self-determination. They can choose how they want that to look. And I'll read you a little bit of language from the Department of Developmental Services directive specifically on independent facilitators. And again, that's a great resource document to take a look. And so independent facilitators, as defined in Welfare and Institution Code 46858 C2, are people who are selected and directed by the participant and who are able to provide assistance in the following ways: assisting the individual with making informed decision-making, regarding their individual budget, locating, accessing, and coordinating services and supports consistent with the participant's IPP, identifying immediate and long-term needs, and developing options to meet those needs for a participant, leading, participating, or advocating on behalf of the person served, the participant, in person-centered planning process and or in the development of the IPP, and obtaining identified services and supports, right? So a variety of different roles. So who can be an independent facilitator? So for those that are seeking to be or who are asked to be paid independent facilitators, that's a little bit more specific. So paid independent facilitators can be family members, can be neighbors, can be community members, other professionals. They can be service providers who don't provide other services to that person. Okay, so that's pretty key there. So if we think about unpaid, who can be unpaid independent facilitators, now you have a little bit more flexibility there. So that can also include parents of a minor. It can also include the spouse of a participant or a person served. It can also include a case manager or a service coordinator from the regional center. They're ready and able to provide many of the functions. And then I'll read a little bit more about the who, the language specifically from the directive, again, available on the Department of Developmental Services website. So I just want to highlight, it says the following individuals may not act as paid independent facilitators, meaning these types of independent facilitators cannot get paid. A person who is providing other services to the participant pursuant to his or her IPP, a person employed by the person or an agency providing services to the participant, the parent of a minor participant, or the spouse of a participant, okay? And so a little bit more about independent facilitator requirements. There is no specific certification, okay, for an independent facilitator. There's no there's no certification or certain type of training that will only do, that's not the case. But a person who's an independent facilitator needs to be able to understand and show that they have the education, the training, and the knowledge about the 5 principles of self-determination, about person-centered planning, and general knowledge of self-determination. And it's really important that all of that needs to be ideally beyond this training. You know, spend the time. This training is really the start of your journey in independent facilitation. It's not the end. So this series of trainings, these modules should really help you think about, okay, what to dive into next, what to look at deeper as you start to think about your independent facilitator practice. Okay, so a little bit more about requirements here. So an independent facilitator should be prepared to provide guidance, resource information, and support, be willing to communicate with all parties involved, however, keeping the main focus on the participant or the person served's wants and needs. They need to maintain participant confidentiality, of course, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in future sections. And they need to maintain open communication with all involved parties. That's so important, and we'll really cover more components and attributes and skills that we believe independent facilitators should have for success. We're going to cover some of those topics, specifically in sections 6, 7, and 8. It's important to know, again, that these training modules, these sections that you're watching, these are just the beginning of your prep work and not the end. These will help you know what to dig in a little bit deeper into to prepare for your role. So, you know, put in those hours, get ready to do that work, and that definitely will help you have a more successful independent facilitator practice and more productive working relationships with all parties involved, especially the person or the people that you're serving. So a little note about rates. And rates can be discussed for people that are serving as paid independent facilitators. And remember, there's going to be paid and unpaid independent facilitators. So rates should be discussed between the independent facilitator and the participant. There definitely should be a mutual agreement made between both parties. An independent facilitator can charge an hourly rate or a monthly type of contract or something a little bit different, but it should be a contract based on defined deliverables, something else. So you should have a contractual agreement that really spells out what those deliverables are and how that billing will look. The cost of the independent facilitator is included in the spending plan, so it comes out of that spending plan, so it needs to be accounted for there. If somebody's going to use a paid independent facilitator, and remember, they may choose not to, or they may choose to access an unpaid independent facilitator. But definitely a contract is recommended, whether you're looking at a paid independent facilitator or an unpaid. And remember, it's important to define ahead of time for a person served and the independent facilitator to discuss what duties or what areas that will be covered in that independent facilitator work, the scope of service, because it's going to look different based on the specific needs of that individual. And it will be important for you as an independent facilitator, whether you're paid or unpaid, to really define your skill set and your specialties in this line of work, okay? So now we're going to spend a few more minutes going over roles a bit further and some of the key concepts for these various roles in self-determination. All right, role of the regional center in the individual program plan and self-determination. So the regional center and the regional center service coordinator or case manager will continue to play an important role in self-determination. So they have a very important role in traditional services. They will continue to have an important role as someone transitions to self-determination. The service coordinator or the case manager is a member of the person serves team, a very important member. The participant will still have that case manager or service coordinator responsible for maintaining the individual program plan. The service coordinator or the case manager is responsible for developing and certifying the self-determination budget with input from the participant, of course. The participant or the person served will work with that case manager or that service coordinator with their spending plan. And we're going to cover more information about the certification process in section 3, module 3 of this training, okay? So regarding the certification of the budget. Okay, so a bit more about the role of the regional center and the service coordinator or the case manager. So the service coordinator or the case manager is going to pass the budget phase, will be able to enter in the spending plan into the individual program plan, and then we'll notify the selected financial management services that's going to be serving that individual. And remember, everybody in self-determination has to have a financial management service. The participant or the person served is going to notify their case manager, their service coordinator, if they want to change their spending plan categories, move amounts around so that the individualized program plan can be updated. And the participant or the person served will still have an individual program plan that reflects their person-centered plan and their current spending plan, okay? And you'll get more detailed information about that spending plan in an upcoming training section. That's in section 5, module 5, okay? And also, just a reminder again to take a look at that statute and take a look at some of those Department of Developmental Services directives that will give you a little more insight into the role specifically of the regional center in self-determination. All right, financial management services. So you know this by now, the financial management service is the only required vendor in self-determination and ensures financial accountability. Accountability, that's the big focus here. So financial management service providers also have to comply with requirements outlined in section 54327 of Title 17. And that includes reporting any special incidents that they might become aware of. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the health and safety section that's further on in the training series here. The regional center or an independent facilitator can help a person served locate and select a financial management service provider that serves in their region. In the next slide, we'll look again at the key parts of the role here, okay? So the financial management services role, again, it's referring to Welfare and Institution Code 4685.8, this time F1. So a couple of buckets here of the work. So spending plan management. So managing distribution of funds, ensuring financial resources to implement the individual program plan, a bill pay service, okay? Also the provider of employment. So the facilitating the employment of the workers that are hired and that are going to be serving the person served. They also will facilitate criminal background checks as needed for certain types of workers that the person served will hire. And then they're going to be the big documentation folks. They have a lot of responsibility there around monthly spending statements to participants, people served, and to their regional center service coordinator, their case manager on that, okay? So the financial management services is helping keep these important parts of that person's self-determination program in order and helping the person served to make sure that their support staff and workers are eligible to provide the services that they're actually brought on to do. We'll talk more about this, about the different models, but just for now, know that there are 3 different models of financial management services. There's a bill payer model, there's a participant as a sole employer model, and a participant in financial management services as co-employer model, okay? We're going to talk about that more in an upcoming training section, but just for now, know that there's 3 different models of financial management services, depending on what works for that individual person's needs. So that person served is going to work with their circle of support to develop a solid understanding of what's going to be the best model for them based on their circumstances. And they should think about that level of responsibility and what level of responsibility that person served is going to want to have with things like hiring and firing workers, what kinds of reminders they might want to stay within their budget, the level of financial liability they would like to take on, what kind of spending they expect to be doing in self-determination. For example, do they think they'll be spending more of their budget on workers or on products or supplies or on both, right? Generally, how involved do they want to be in the financial processes of their self-determination program? So those are some questions that they can ask themselves to determine what model is going to work best. So individual budget, okay, a little bit more about the budget. So determining the budget, there's a few steps there, right? So for existing participants or individuals that are already served in the regional center system, your baseline for this work for determining a budget is looking at what was spent, the expenditures of regional center services over the last 12 months. But what if you're new to the regional center? What if you don't have a history of accessing regional center services? Then the baseline where you're starting this calculation from is based on the average of what's spent on those with similar needs. So similar age and lifestyle, living environment, that kind of thing. But that's just the baseline, because then there's going to be some changes to the budget before the budget is finalized, okay? So we talked about how we're starting with that baseline, and then there's a few more steps in order to get to the final budget. So the IPP team starts to work this out with last year's expenditures or what the regional center would have expected to spend based on other people with similar situations. And then those extra steps go like this. So the first thing would be to think about unmet needs, right? Unmet needs would be needed services that are in the individualized program plan but weren't used or weren't located. Needs that weren't addressed in the individual program plan, right? So that would be different categories of unmet need. Also think about changes in circumstances. So here's one. If you're someone who is leaving school district services and moving on to your adult life and adult services, that's a big change in circumstance. Or maybe you're moving and you have a different living environment and have different residential service needs or service needs depending on where you're living. So those are some examples of change in circumstances. So then what's happening now when looking at the budget would be identifying the services and the supports that are either one-time or otherwise not continuing based on that change in need. So non-continuing services are things like initial person-centered planning services for the actual transition into self-determination. Non-continuing services could also be things like, the kind of one-time non-continuing things like home modifications that might be needed and funded, vehicle modifications, durable medical equipment or services that that are included in the baseline amount but are no longer needed. So you're identifying all of those one-time or non-continuing types of services that were funded or supports that were funded. Then the next step would be identifying services and supports that were and are available to the individual, but are going to be funded outside of the self-determination calculation, outside of the self-determination budget. We're going to talk more about this, but I just want to expose you to some of the terms in the multi-step process. Some examples of this, of certain supports and services that are available and can be funded for an individual, but would take place kind of outside of the self-determination funds calculation. Some examples of that would be, let's say, the competitive integrated employment incentive payments, CIE payments, maybe payments that somebody is getting through their paid internship program, their PIP. This could also include SSI, SSP restoration payments, certain costs for insurance co-payments. There's some categories, some various categories that can include. Whoops. So again, we're going to cover this in more detail in an upcoming section. But also, before we move on, are there restrictions on what the individual budget can be used for once it's set? In short, yes. The individual budget can only purchase services and supports that are approved by the federal government and listed in the program waiver. But that actually covers quite a bit of subcategories and types of services, supplies, and support. So we're going to show you that in a bit. But just keep that in mind as we continue to talk further about this. All right, spending plan categories. So once a person's budget is certified, then the next step is to build a spending plan that shows how those funds will be spent, okay? So two very different parts of that process, two separate processes. And again, you're gonna learn a lot more about both, about the budget and budget certification, and then building the spending plan. So one of the beautiful parts of self-determination is the streamlined spending categories. And that's what the person served digs into after their budget certification. And the reason why this is so great is because the three major spending categories mean that there's more flexibility for that person served, that participant, to shift some of the spending if their needs change without going through major changes in their IPP, okay? You're going to learn more about that in the spending plan and services section, but just keep in mind, these three major categories, it's a good thing. So for now, just keep in mind that a person's spending plan options, you have these three major categories, okay? And then you have many more subcategories within each of these major categories. And then you have a lot of service codes and different service descriptions, all of which you can read about on the Department of Developmental Services webpage. You can read it, have a whole listing, download a whole listing so that you can see what some of those service codes and service descriptions are. But for now, just thinking about those three major categories, everything would fall under either living arrangements, employment and community participation, or health and safety. Okay, so keeping it nice and easy with those three categories. Woo! Congratulations. You are wrapping up section 1, the first module of this training, and hopefully you're probably thinking about a lot of things right now, but we also hope that this has you excited to learn more about self-determination and about the role of independent facilitation. So we just covered a few things, okay? We covered an overview of this from the perspective of the independent facilitator. We covered the history of self-determination program, including the Lanterman Act and self-determination, the principles of self-determination program, freedom, authority, support, responsibility, confirmation, the process, which includes orientation, person-centered planning, budget certification, spending plan, individualized program plan, financial management services, and then the roles, including independent facilitator, one's circle of support, their IPP team, and again, the financial management services. We covered quite a lot. So thank you so much for joining us for this section 1. We thank you for your leadership and your teamwork, and we're looking forward to you joining us for upcoming modules and training sections. There's a lot more to dig into, so we hope you join us.